Some smells trigger memories. Others are warnings. But there's one smell people in Blackmere Forest swear you should never follow. Because once it finds you, it never leaves. People like to say that forests are quiet at night. That once the sun goes down and the wind settles, everything becomes peaceful. That idea couldn't be further from the truth. Forests don't go silent. They wait. In October of 2011, Daniel Mercer returned to the town he had spent most of his childhood trying to forget. It wasn't nostalgia that brought him back, nor a desire to reconnect with old memories. It was obligation. His father had passed away suddenly, leaving behind a modest, aging house on the very edge of Blackmere Forest. The house had been in the family for generations. Daniel remembered visiting it as a child, though his memories were blurred and distant, softened by time. What he remembered most clearly was the rule his father had always enforced without explanation. Never go into the forest after dark. Daniel had never questioned it back then. As a child, rules didn't need reasons. As an adult, however, he dismissed it as old superstition. The forest, after all, was just trees. Blackmere Forest stretched for miles beyond the back of the property, a dense mass of oak, pine, and twisted undergrowth. Officially, it was listed as safe woodland. Unofficially, locals avoided it whenever possible. Stories circulated, half-joking and half-serious, about strange smells, figures seen at a distance, and people getting lost despite the trails being clearly marked. Daniel laughed those stories off. He moved into the house alone. The first 2 nights passed uneventfully. The house creaked as old houses do, and the wind occasionally rattled the windows. Daniel chalked it up to unfamiliar surroundings and the lingering weight of grief. It was on the 3rd night that something changed. Daniel woke shortly after midnight with an uncomfortable tightness in his chest. At first, he thought it was anxiety or a half-remembered dream. He sat up in bed and took a slow breath. That's when he noticed the smell. It was faint but unmistakable. Burnt wood. No, not just wood. There was something sharper mixed in. A metallic edge, like overheated iron or scorched wiring. The smell stung his nose and lingered at the back of his throat. Daniel swung his legs out of bed and stood, scanning the room. There was no smoke. No haze. The air looked perfectly clear. He checked the heater. Off. The fireplace hadn't been used in years. He opened the bedroom window, expecting cool night air to wash the smell away. Instead, the scent grew stronger. It was coming from outside. From the forest. Daniel leaned out, squinting into the darkness. The tree line stood motionless, a solid wall of black shapes under the moonlight. There was no fire, no glow, no sign of anything burning. And yet the smell persisted. Uneasy now, Daniel closed the window and returned to bed. He told himself it was his imagination, or perhaps a distant bonfire carried by the wind. Eventually, exhaustion pulled him back into sleep. The smell returned the next night. And the next. Always after midnight. Always stronger. By the 5th night, it was impossible to ignore. That was also the night Daniel heard the footsteps. He had been sitting in the living room, the television muted, when a faint sound drifted through the house. At first, it was so subtle he almost missed it. A crunch. Then another. Slow. Deliberate. Daniel muted the TV completely and listened. The sound wasn't coming from the road. It wasn't footsteps on pavement or gravel. It was the unmistakable sound of leaves and twigs being crushed underfoot. Inside the forest. The footsteps moved steadily, not hurried, not cautious. Whoever or whatever was walking didn't seem concerned about being heard. Daniel stood, heart pounding, and stepped closer to the back window. The moment he stopped moving, the footsteps stopped too. The forest went deathly still. Daniel held his breath. Seconds passed. Then, somewhere deep between the trees, the sound resumed, slower now, heavier. As if something had realized it was being listened to. Daniel backed away from the window, his skin prickling with unease. He locked the doors, checked the windows, and turned on every light in the house. That night, sleep didn't come easily. As Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, one thought repeated over and over in his mind. The forest knows I'm here. And for the first time since returning home, he wondered if his father's warning had never been about superstition at all. By the seventh night, Daniel Mercer stopped pretending everything was normal. The smell no longer drifted in gently. It pushed its way into the house, thick and invasive, like it had weight. Burnt wood. Hot metal. Something rotten underneath it all, something unmistakably wrong. Daniel woke before midnight this time. He hadn't heard anything yet, but his body knew. His heart was already racing, his skin damp with sweat, his throat tight as if bracing for pain. The smell was everywhere. It clung to the curtains, the furniture, his clothes. Daniel stumbled out of bed and moved through the darkened hallway, every creak of the floorboard sounding too loud. When he reached the kitchen, he stopped dead. The back door was fogged from the inside. Not condensation. Handprints. Dark smudges pressed against the glass from the outside, smeared and uneven, as though whatever had touched the door didn't have the strength to press evenly. Daniel's stomach dropped. He reached for the light switch. Nothing happened. The house was silent now, no hum of electricity, no ticking, no wind. Just the smell. Then came the sound. A single step. Outside. Daniel forced himself to breathe and approached the door slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, pale, hollow-eyed, afraid. He wiped a small clear patch on the fogged glass with his sleeve and peered out. At first, he saw nothing. Then something moved. At the edge of the forest, just beyond where the yard dissolved into tangled roots and shadow, stood a figure. It didn't sway with the wind. It didn't blink. It stood unnaturally still, as if frozen mid-step. The porch light flickered on without Daniel touching the switch. The light washed over the figure. It was a man. At least, it had once been. The man's clothes hung in blackened strips, fused to his body in places as though they had melted and cooled there. His skin was dark and cracked, like burned earth after a wildfire. Thin trails of something darker ran down his arms and neck, dried long ago. Steam rose faintly from him, drifting upward into the cold night air. Daniel's knees threatened to give out. The man took a step forward. The grass beneath his foot didn't bend. It charred. Daniel backed away from the door, shaking his head. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." He slammed the door shut and locked it, then backed into the kitchen counter, gasping for breath. His ears rang. His vision narrowed. A sound scraped along the outside wall. Slow. Deliberate. Something was moving around the house. Daniel grabbed his phone. No signal. No power. The scraping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Then came the knock. Not loud. Not aggressive. A slow, careful knock, as if whoever was there didn't want to damage the door. One knock. Pause. Another knock. Daniel pressed his hands over his ears, squeezing his eyes shut. A voice followed. Dry. cracked. Too close. Daniel. He hadn't told anyone he was back. The voice didn't come from outside. It came from everywhere. From the walls. From the floor. From inside his head. I didn't mean to burn, the voice whispered. They left me here. The smell intensified, becoming unbearable. Daniel gagged, tears streaming down his face. The lights flashed. In that brief burst of illumination, Daniel saw something that made his blood run cold. Dark handprints were appearing on the walls. Not smeared on from the outside. They were pushing out from within the walls, stretching the paint thin as if something underneath was pressing forward, trying to break through. The knocking stopped. Silence returned. Daniel opened his eyes. The house was still. No smell. No sound. Slowly, he approached the back door again. The porch was empty. The forest stood quiet and dark, as if nothing had ever been there. But when Daniel stepped outside, his foot landed in something brittle. He looked down. Burned footprints marked the ground, leading away from the porch and straight into the forest. And though the night air was cold, the prints still smoked faintly. From deep among the trees, something watched him. And for the first time, Daniel understood the truth. The forest wasn't haunted. It was remembering. And it had finally found someone who could hear it. Daniel Mercer did not sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the smell returned, thick, choking, crawling down his throat like smoke. Even with the windows open and the cold night air pouring in, it lingered, faint but present, as though it had soaked into the walls themselves. By morning, exhaustion had dulled his fear into something sharper and more dangerous, determination. If something was happening in Blackmere Forest, it had started long before Daniel returned. And if there were answers, they wouldn't be found hiding inside the house. They would be buried. The town archive occupied a narrow brick building near the old railway line. Daniel remembered passing it countless times as a child, never once imagining he'd be desperate to step inside. The clerk barely looked up as Daniel signed the visitor log, her eyes lingering just long enough to register the dark circles under his eyes. He asked about Blackmere Forest. The reaction was immediate. A pause. A tightening of the jaw. A glance toward the back rooms. Try the industrial records, she said quietly. Pre-1950. That was all. The files were old, brittle with age, their pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Daniel worked methodically, flipping through reports of land surveys, logging routes, and wartime requisitions. Hours passed before he found it. A thin folder labeled Temporary Operations, 1943. Inside were accident reports. Photographs. Death notices. Blackmere Forest had once housed a temporary testing facility during the war. Ammunition experiments. Incendiary compounds. Chemical accelerants. The work had been rushed. Corners cut. Safety protocols ignored. On November 17, 1943, something went catastrophically wrong. An explosion tore through the testing compound just after midnight. 3 men were killed instantly. A 4th worker was listed as missing. Daniel's fingers trembled as he read the name. Elliot Harrow. Age, 41. Residence, Blackmere Road. Daniel's address. According to witness statements, Harrow had been seen running from the facility, his clothes aflame, screaming for help before disappearing into the trees. Search parties found scorched ground, melted equipment, and traces of burned fabric. They never found the body. The final report concluded that Harrow had likely succumbed to his injuries somewhere deep in the forest and was never recovered. Daniel closed the folder slowly. The smell. The footprints. The voice that knew his name. That night, Daniel returned home with the sun already sinking behind the tree-line. The forest seemed closer than before, the shadows longer, thicker. He locked every door and pulled every curtain tight. It didn't matter. The smell returned before midnight. Stronger than ever. Daniel sat in the living room, surrounded by lights, clutching the old file he'd taken photos of on his phone. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his teeth. Then the house creaked. Not the normal settling of old wood. This was different. Intentional. A sound moved through the hallway, slow and dragging, as if something heavy were being pulled across the floor. The temperature dropped sharply, his breath fogging the air. "Elliot?" Daniel whispered before he could stop himself. The answer came immediately. From behind him. "I remember fire," the voice said. "I remember pain." Daniel spun around. The walls were changing. Dark stains spread across the paint like bruises blooming beneath skin. The smell of burning flesh filled the room, so strong Daniel gagged and dropped to his knees. The floor grew hot beneath his hands. Blisteringly hot. Daniel screamed and scrambled backward as the carpet blackened and curled, smoke rising in thin, twisting streams. Shapes began to form in the walls. Not faces, impressions. Arms pressed outward. Hands clawing. A body trapped between layers of plaster and wood, struggling to force itself through. "They left me," the voice rasped. "They closed the forest and called it finished." A silhouette emerged near the back door, flickering like a reflection in heat haze. The burned man stood half-formed, his outline unstable, as though reality struggled to hold him. "I walked until there was nothing left to burn," he continued. "But the forest kept me." Daniel's skin prickled with terror as the figure turned its hollow gaze toward him. "You live where I ended." The lights exploded. Glass shattered outward as the windows cracked from sudden heat. Daniel felt his clothes grow warm, then hot, panic clawing up his throat as the air itself seemed to ignite. "No," he screamed. "I'm not part of this." The figure stepped closer. "You are now." The front door burst open. Cold night air rushed in, colliding with heat and smoke. Daniel didn't think, he ran. Out of the house. Across the yard. Straight toward the trees. Behind him, something followed. Not running. Walking. Patient. And as Daniel crossed the tree line, the smell intensified, wrapping around him like a promise. The forest had waited decades. And it had finally found someone who could carry its pain forward. The forest swallowed sound first. Daniel felt at the moment he crossed the tree line as if the world behind him had been sealed shut. The night air grew thick and damp, heavy with the familiar stench of ash and scorched metal. Each breath scraped his throat raw. His shoes slipped against roots and damp soil as he ran blindly between the trees, branches tearing at his clothes and skin. Behind him, the footsteps continued. Unhurried. Certain. Daniel's lungs burned as badly as his legs. He dared a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. The burned man moved through the forest without disturbing it. Leaves didn't crunch beneath his feet. Branches didn't bend. The darkness itself seemed to part for him, closing again once he passed. And he was closer now. Daniel tripped and fell hard, the breath knocked from his chest. He scrambled, palms pressing into the cold earth, then recoiled with a scream. The ground beneath his hands was warm. Not naturally warm. Alive with heat. Blackened shapes emerged from the soil around him, half-melted debris, twisted metal fragments, warped remnants of something industrial long since swallowed by the forest. The ruins of the testing facility. "I didn't mean to bring you back," Daniel gasped, crawling backward. "I didn't know." The burned figure stopped a few feet away. Up close, the damage was worse. Flesh fused to fabric. Skin split and cracked like dried clay. One side of his face sagged unnaturally, features melted and unfinished, as if fire had been interrupted mid-work. "You didn't bring me back," Elliot Harrow said softly. "You listened." The forest pulsed with heat. Daniel felt it crawl up his legs, his arms, into his chest. His clothes began to smoke faintly. "I stayed," Elliot continued. "When the fire ended, when the screaming stopped. I stayed. The forest took what was left and kept it." Daniel shook his head violently. "I don't belong here." Elliot tilted his head, considering him. "Neither did I." The trees around them seemed to lean inward, their shadows stretching and tangling together. Daniel felt something grip him, not hands, but memory. Pain pressed into him from every direction. The heat. The fear. The unbearable awareness of skin burning, lungs filling with smoke, hope vanishing with every step into the dark. Daniel screamed as visions flooded his mind. Men running. Fire blooming. Skin igniting. A voice crying for help that never came. The pain was so real he could feel his own flesh blistering. Then, silence. Cold replaced heat. Daniel collapsed onto the forest floor, shaking, sobbing. The smell faded, leaving only damp earth and moss. When he looked up, Elliot Harrow was gone. So was the forest. Daniel found himself standing at the edge of the clearing behind his house. Morning light filtered weakly through the trees. Birds sang. The world looked painfully ordinary. For a moment, Daniel wondered if it had all been a hallucination. Then he looked down at his hands. Dark stains marked his palms, smeared and uneven. Burned handprints. Daniel staggered back into the house. Days passed. Daniel stopped answering calls. He didn't return messages. Neighbors noticed smoke drifting from his chimney at odd hours, though no fire was ever lit. At night, lights flickered inside the house long after midnight. People walking past reported a strange smell. Burnt wood. Hot metal. On the seventh day, a neighbor called the police. The house was empty. No signs of struggle. No fire damage. No body. Only footprints leading from the back door toward the forest. They weren't burned. They were blackened, as though something had drained the warmth from them. Daniel Mercer was officially listed as a missing person. Searches turned up nothing. Eventually, the case went cold. But the forest didn't. In the months that followed, hikers began reporting sightings. A tall, burned figure seen at the edge of the trees after dark. Sometimes alone. Sometimes walking beside another shape. A man with a hollow stare, his clothes intact but his skin marked with dark, uneven stains. Witnesses described a smell that lingered long after the figures vanished. Burnt wood. Metal. And something human. Locals learned to avoid Blackmere Forest after midnight. Because some say that if you stand still long enough near the tree-line, if you breathe in deep enough, you might hear footsteps behind you. Not running. Not chasing. Just walking. Patient. Waiting for someone new to listen. And once the forest remembers you, it never forgets. Moral. Some places are quiet because they are empty. Others are quiet because they are full of what was never allowed to leave. The forest did not hunt Daniel. It waited. Pain that is ignored does not disappear, it settles, it roots itself, and it looks for someone willing to listen. When history is buried instead of faced, it finds a way to breathe again through the living. Not every warning is loud. Not every danger runs toward you. Some simply walk behind you. Until you stop pretending you can't hear them.